Okay, so we'll get started in around a minute's time. And what I'm going to do is just in about a few seconds time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off the recording. So if you don't want to be recorded, obviously drop off. We are going to make all the recordings available at the end of all the sessions. So they're just going to have to be reviewed. Beaten me to it and started the recording. Okay, great. Okay, so we're now at 4 o'clock on the dot, or GMT time, 3 p.m. So we've got Joe today talking about the Microsoft Dataverse. Obviously, we've been talking about the Dataverse throughout the day, and Joe's going to give us a bit of a deep dive into that. And obviously, really excited to have you on. And thank you so much for doing this and contributing to the community. So yeah, without further ado, please take it away. And yeah, we look forward to the session.
Wow. That's what an intro, Chris. Thank you very much. Okay, yeah, so as Chris says, we're going to be taking a bit of a deep dive look now into how we can work with Microsoft Dataverse in Power BI, sort of show you some sort of tips and tricks and things to hope that can hopefully you can go away and start to play with yourself if you are indeed looking at working with Power BI in the context of Dataverse. So we'll give you a bit of background first of all. It may be that most of the attendees today are familiar with what the Dataverse is, but it's just useful maybe just to touch upon it quickly. We'll see how it fits within the sort of the wider Power Platform. Obviously, Power BI and Dataverse are in the sort of same family, as it were. And we'll also touch upon this interesting dynamic, no pun intended, that we've got involved with Dynamics 365. You know, how does this sort of fit in? Is it a bit of an awkward bedfellow, or is it maybe something a bit more beyond that? We'll then look at some of the various different ways we can start to use Power BI with Dataverse. So there's a few different options depending on whether you're working in Power BI Online, whether you're consuming things from Power BI Desktop. And you've also got some interesting integration options when it comes to working with your Power BI content from within your model-driven Power Apps. And then we'll finally touch off with some closing remarks as well, just some sort of top of mind views and things from my side really on that one. As we've touched upon already, I want to try and keep this maybe as an interactive session. So if you have got questions as we're going through, please do put them into the chat. I can see directly there, and then also we can also unmute, maybe have a bit of a discussion at the end as well if time allows. Okay. So a little bit about me on the slide here. So hello, my name is Joe. I am Managing Director for a relatively small Microsoft Gold partner based here in the UK, Solar Cloud Solutions. We do a lot of consultancy and managed services covering Power Platform, Dynamics 365, Azure. Basically, if it's Microsoft Cloud and it's not SharePoint, then it's potentially something that we will do quite a bit. You can find me on all of the different social networks, so it'd be really great to connect with you after this session. My details are on there. I'm also a fairly regular blogger as well. Also got a bit of addiction to Microsoft badges, as you can see. I think once you get started, it sort of becomes like a bit like Pokemon. You just want to get them all in terms of the badges. So yeah, at the moment, a little bit addicted to getting them all, perhaps. Okay, so just before we continue then, so Yves has come back with another question again. He's asking whether it's possible to use Power Automate to extract the Excel from Dynamics and save it into a folder so that Power BI will use the Excel as a data set, let's say every 3 hours, please. As far as I know, there's no way in which we can sort of call the export to Excel feature from the Dataverse web API. What you would have to do instead is that you would have to do a list record step from Power Automate and then populate a spreadsheet dynamically based on that. From memory, I'm pretty sure that you have got an action step for Microsoft Excel that will let you insert a row into, let's say, a spreadsheet or a particular table in your spreadsheet. Okay, so that would be probably the way in which I would approach that. Okay, so I hope that helps. Yep, and CDS is the Dataverse. Yeah, so this leads us very nicely in terms of the same slide. So Dataverse is effectively just a bit of a rebrand of the product that we used to know as the Common Data Service. Okay, so it's been around now for 5 years. Actually, it doesn't feel that long, but yeah, it's actually I guess you'd call it a mature product now in sort of cloud terms. And really, what we've got here as part of Microsoft Dataverse is a sort of central database or storage unit that we can leverage to sort of bring together our core business data and work with it from within the Power Platform. So if we don't already have a database, a SQL Server database, or any other kind of vendor database, then the common data server, sorry, the Microsoft Dataverse, I should say, could be a really good candidate for you to consider. This is a cloud-only product, so you're not going to be able to sort of set up and consume this on-premise, like things like SharePoint or Exchange Online or things like that. And it supports a variety of different features, such as the ability to have different sort of tables for your business data. You can have things such as custom calculated or roll-up columns covering a vast variety of different sort of data types. We can automate some of our internal business logic using things such as, let's say, business rules. We can extend out into things, as we touched upon, like Power Automate, to be able to model out our business processes using that and then sync that data back into the Dataverse. And then finally, and one of the benefits of this, potentially compared to other storage options in the Power Platform or indeed the Microsoft Cloud Stack, is that you've got a really highly customizable security access framework that we can leverage. So we can really sort of fine tune a particular user's or group of users' permissions in order to suit our particular sort of needs. And typically how I would go about maybe describing Dataverse, okay, it's going to do everything that SQL Server can do, but more. So it's sort of like a really nicely beefed up sort of SQL Server. So, and it's really probably quite a good candidate for you to consider, where you don't want to necessarily go through the development cycle of having to build and maintain your own SQL Server database. There will be situations where maybe a SQL Server database will be a better candidate compared to Dataverse. But in most cases, Dataverse is going to be a nicer experience. It's going to be maintainable, and it's going to come with a lot more out of the box. And Matthew's case, a good comment there. Data in Dataverse seems easy to grab, but not easy to grasp. Yeah, I suppose that's a fair assessment. I suppose you could probably say that with any maybe database system, really, depending on the complexity of it. But yeah, as we'll hopefully see today in today's session, it's really straightforward for us to actually get data out into our chosen tool, and in this case being Power BI as an example. So this diagram here, you may have seen this already, or maybe sick of seeing it perhaps, but this sort of shows you where the Dataverse sort of sits within the Dataverse, within the Power Platform. So effectively, it's at that sort of bottom layer. It's sort of the cornerstone sort of application that we can leverage alongside things such as, let's say, AI Builder and data connectors. And ultimately, all of the tools that we can see up here will be able to sort of work with and consume Dataverse in some sort of shape or format. So if we've got, let's say, an AI chatbot that we want to be able to look up information from our Dataverse, regarding our customers, and be able to sort of reply back to our customers with that information, that's going to allow us to do that. If we've got, let's say, a Canvas app that wants to connect up to our Dataverse environment, then again, we can also use that as well. So we've got quite a, we've got lots of really effective ways in which we can start to maybe think about using Dataverse in the Power Platform, and maybe even beyond as well, perhaps. Okay, I've just seen we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just get off quickly. So Tripana, hi Tripana. So last hackathon, you faced huge performance issues when connecting data from Power BI to Dataverse. Is it because you're using a trial tenant, or do you face anything generally? Finally, to make it working, we had to use Power Automate to put it into Excel and held in SharePoint to use it. So yes, so trial tenants will be sort of not as beefed up, I guess, from a performance standpoint compared to let's say a production environment. It's not something I've ever come across myself in terms of it when I've been using my own trial environments and things like that. It may be that in the example, maybe if you switch to, let's say, direct import mode instead of using direct query, that might have actually helped with performance. Swanard's asked another question: does Dataverse support stored procedures, indexes, etc.? So Dataverse is in effect a SQL Server database behind the scenes. We're not going to have the ability to go in and write our own stored procedures that we can then execute behind that, but we've # similar functionality that we can build out. So for example, instead of, let's say, having a stored procedure that maybe does some transformation and returns as a value, we could instead write a C# custom API call, and that would instead be our stored procedure. Indexes are created and managed by the application automatically, and there's some things that we can do from a configuration standpoint to basically force the Dataverse environment to create those indexes for us. And then finally, Yves again, you mentioned that Dataverse supports roll-up columns. In that case, does it mean, is it possible to save a view into the Dataverse and use that view as a data set? You can create a query, you can create a view. You can create a view, and the root view can reference roll-up columns if that's what you're asking for. So effectively, you just create a view as you would in the interface as you would anything else. Okay, hope that answers your question. Okay, so when we start to think about Dataverse, you may end up hearing and starting to think about Dynamics 365 customer engagement, and it's something that is very much tied to the Dataverse. And this is because originally the Dataverse is effectively what used to be the old Dynamics CRM on-premise database that was originally, as I say, available on-premise. It was moved to the cloud generally over time, and today is now effectively used within the Power Platform to basically as the data store, not only for anything we build in the Power Platform, but also for any of the customer engagement applications, whether that's sales, service, field service, project operations, things like that. So typically, when you hear people talking about the Dynamics 365 CE database in the Dataverse, it is the same thing. So effectively, much of the same things that we can do with the Dynamics 365 CE database, we can also do with Dataverse as well. And sometimes having an understanding of that history can be sometimes useful in terms of figuring out what can I actually do with Dataverse. And certainly sometimes if you are doing some research or trying to find an answer to a particular problem, then maybe just adjusting some of your search terms may actually end up finding you the right answer. And in most cases, a solution that would previously work for Dynamics CRM or 365 CE will also work with Dataverse, provided, of course, it's not been deprecated or removed in the product since the particular issue was raised or whatever. Okay, so that context has been useful. So let's jump in now and have a look at how we can get started with Microsoft Dataverse in Power BI. So at this point, it's useful just to touch upon some of the licensing considerations around all of this. As you may already know, we get Power BI free that anybody can sign up to and use as part of that. The next step up from that will be our Power BI Professional. This is and remains to this date a separate sort of license that we would have to acquire on top of it. So let's say if we're in a situation where we've got 20 or 30, let's say Power Apps per user licenses in our environment. If we wanted to start using Power BI to maybe build out some reports and share that in our organization, then we're going to have to go away and buy those additional Power BI Professional licenses. It's not something that's going to be included with our Power Apps licensing or indeed our Power Automate licenses or whatever else out of the box. So we always need to make sure that users who are starting to consume content from the Dataverse have either a free or professional license. They may also, if it's a case that you are working with Power BI Premium, then instead what you may need to make sure that you've got is a workspace setup that has been assigned to a premium capacity. And then from there, the users who have a free Power BI license should be able to get in and start consuming content from there. So in most cases, the free license may actually give you everything you need, but do keep in mind some limitations around this. So for example, you're not going to be able to share out content as easily, both to internal or external users. You're not going to be able to do things like schedule refresh. You can't install any apps from AppSource or any apps in the organization. And there will be some limitations around the size of your data set and the amount of times that you can refresh that in a particular day, as an example. I think from memory, and it may have changed, so apologies if it has, but I think it's 2 GB you get by default with the Power BI free offering, which is a decent amount. But if you're working with quite a lot of data, then you could start to hit that headroom fairly quickly. Okay, so the first way in which we can consume Dataverse data is using Power BI Online. And the main way which we would do this is via a tool called Data Flows. So at the moment, we've got a connector available on here, the Common Data Service Legacy Connector, which we'll return to in a short while. We can basically use Data Flows and that connector to bring in all of our data from our Dataverse into a sort of single model. We can do the necessary prep on that data and then publish that out for users within the organization to start to consume all of that. So we're going to have access to pretty much all of the different system and custom tables that exist in our Dataverse as part of that. It may be that we have to spend a bit of time just shaping and modeling that data to get it how it needs to be. And we also may need to have some familiarity with how the Dataverse common data model works as well. And then finally, this is also going to be something that you're not going to be able to get with Power BI free. So you're going to need to have paid either for a Power BI Professional license or be consuming some kind of premium capacity, either per user or or a dedicated capacity each month. So this option is really great if you're wanting to maybe create these sort of self-service sort of data sets within your organization that maybe brings together all of your Dataverse data into a single nicely sort of prepped sort of model that can then be consumed from various different reports and dashboards, etc. So a nice little tool to consider. So from a setup standpoint, you'd make sure that you first of all select the appropriate connector. So in this case, the Common Data Service legacy connector on there at the moment. We pass in the server URL and we make sure we're logged in using an organizational account. And then from there, we can then start to consume the data further from there. It's all well and good talking about it, but let's just jump in now and just see how that process works from within the portal. So I'm just going to jump into Power BI Online over here. So I've already got a workspace set up with some content, which is going to will return to as part of the later demos. And what I want to do first of all is click on New in my workspace and then select the data flow option up here. I then want to click the option at the top that says Add Tables. It's going to ask me to select my data source. So as we saw, we can select the Common Data Service Legacy connector down here. I need to make sure that I've passed in my server URL. So I'm just going to grab this from my environment, which is over here. This is just the first bit of the server URL from our Dataverse tenant. It's going to ask me to sign in. It's not asking me to. Let me try on another browser. Not because I'm using a guest account. So I'm going to click on Data Flow, Add Tables again. Select Common Data Service Legacy. Let's paste that in, sign in. There we go. So it's just asking me to log in on the other screen. So I'll just click on Sign In just to confirm that. Click on Next. And now what it's going to do is going to go off into my Dataverse environment and it's going to bring out all of the different entities or tables that are within there. And we can see that we've got quite a lot of different sort of tables that are in there already. So as an example, I could just select the account. I could maybe do the contact and maybe just select the task data as well, as an example. Then I click on Transform Data. And then from here, what I'm going to get is a fairly similar experience to sort of the desktop Power Query editor. So effectively, pretty much all of the same kind of options are available to me here to allow me to sort of shape the data in different sort of ways. We can see that it's brought in pretty much every single column from the data source. It's sorted it in sort of alphabetical order, just to sort of help us along. But as we can see, but most Dataverse tables will typically have quite a lot of different sort of columns, so we may need to just spend some time just filtering that down to get the data that we need. For certain types of columns as well, we may see, so for example, if we're working with choice columns, by default, the Dataverse stores these as integers behind the scenes. But what the connector will do is that it will bring in the friendly sort of labels or display values for us instead. So we can maybe use those, and therefore we can know what we know ultimately what the underlying sort of data value is on that. When we're happy with all of this, typically we may want to spend a bit more time just getting this prepped, but for the purpose of the demo, we'll just hit on Save and Close for now. I'll just call this Dataverse demo as an example. Okay, probably would set a refresh schedule around this just to keep the data up to date, but I'll just hit a refresh now just to get the latest data. And this is now consumable from the Power BI Online service, or indeed from the desktop application. So as an example, if I open up Power BI Desktop now, I could click on to Get Data up here, select Power BI Data Flows, and we should see that we've got an option after I've signed in, of course, that will let me specify that. So just give me a moment while I just sign in and no doubt go through the MFA hurdles. Yep. Hit on connect. and we can see that it's listing out all the different workspaces that I've got. And from here, we can see there's my Dataverse demo data flow. And what's quite nice is that I can maybe just select one, or could select maybe all of the tables that are in there. Effectively, I can just pick and choose what I want. So data flows may be a good candidate for you to consider. If you do foresee a need to have that sort of self-service feature within your organization, so that people can just get the data that they want, without, and you can therefore make sure, and as part of that, make sure that the data has been prepped first, and that you've maybe removed any data that maybe is not relevant, or maybe that people don't need to see. Then data flows will be a really good option for you to consider potentially. Okay, so I've got a few questions on here. So Matthias, how to decide which data to upload? What makes sense? There is much noise. I'm not too sure what that question's referring to, Matthias. If you could maybe follow up in the chat with a bit more detail, or we can maybe have a chat about it at the end. I'd be happy to answer that for you. George is asking, are there any good templates or data flows for Dynamics? No, as far as I know, there's no available templates doing that. You would have to probably just go in and probably prep the data yourself. And Shahid, any chances this CDS legacy connector will be deprecated in the near future? If yes, what will be the implication on the reports using this connector? We're going to be jumping into that topic in a few moments, in actual fact, and hopefully we'll answer that question as part of that, Shahid. Okay, so let's jump back to the slides for just a little bit. Okay, so in 9 out of 10, you probably end up working with Power BI through the desktop application. So let's jump in now and look at some of the different options that we've got there to consume Dataverse data from within there. So the primary mechanism, and probably the recommended one for these days, is the Dataverse connector. This is sort of a new connector. We can see it's got a nice shiny green new logo as part of that. And this will be the sort of the connector that we want to try and use as much as possible, sort of moving forward. It's going to allow us to get access to all of our Dataverse data. If we're working with with Power BI Desktop and we're consuming Dataverse in this manner, then we're not necessarily needing to have any licensing concerns enter the mix, because we can just as long as we just deploy this out into our own personal workspace and we don't share it out, then effectively anybody can sort of consume Dataverse data in this manner. The connector at the moment does have a couple of two little issues which is worth just flagging out. So as an example, you're not going to by default get label values or display values back for things like your record IDs or your lookup fields. Effectively, they're going to be coming back as the underlying GUIDs. There's ways in which you can sort of get around that and get hopefully something that's maybe a bit more friendly. You'd have to sort of bring in the columns and sort of using Power Query Editor to do that. But at the moment, that's one limitation with that. And at the moment, the connector doesn't support the ability to call Web API functions. But certainly for new projects, for when if you're just dipping your toe into the Dataverse with Power BI for the first time, this is probably the connector I would recommend you would select. As we can see, we've still got this common data service legacy connector that's on here. That's also still the one that's supported as part of data flows. So to sort of move on now and hopefully answer Shahid's question in the process, it's worth just explaining the differences between both of these and why compare and contrast between that. So the new connector is better in the sense that it gives us the ability to basically access our data using direct query or using import mode. So with direct query, we can get that sort of real-time sort of access into our data. We don't have to set up our schedule refresh or have a bit of a lag on our data when we've pushed it out into the Power BI Online service. In comparison, the common data service legacy connector only supports import mode. This is because the new connector has the ability to work with what we call the TDS or the SQL endpoint that's now available as part of Dataverse. So if your requirement, says that you want the ability to have data refreshed as users are basically getting on the reports each time, then the new connector will be the one that you want to choose. In the new connector, you get your display columns automatically. You have the ability to reorder the columns, so you may need to spend a bit more time just sort of getting everything in a nice order from within the Power Query Editor. The legacy connector has a few additional, maybe what you would term bells and whistles. So you can, for example, call web API functions. You can reorder your columns in alphabetical order. But maybe one drawback of that is that you will potentially need to spend a bit more time bringing in your relationships and modeling that out using the old connector, whereas the Dataverse connector rather handily will bring in all of the relationships as expandable columns into your into your model, and you can then just sort of remove those or expand those out as you want to. And then finally, and hopefully getting to the core of Shahid's question on here, the new connector is the one that is seeing the active investments from Microsoft. This is the one that's going to be improved over time, and the one that's going to be hopefully the safe bet from a technology standpoint. Whereas the old connector, as the name no doubt sort of gives us a clue on, that's not going to see any investments moving forward. So what I would say is, where possible, try and use this new connector where you can, unless you've got a specific scenario that you need to be able to do. So, for example, maybe the ability to call web API functions, that may necessitate you to use this connector as a potential option. As a workaround, what you could do instead is that because the Dataverse web API endpoint is an OData endpoint, we can actually use the OData connector instead, and that could give us potentially a route to be able to maybe do that in a more sort of supported fashion. And that leads us very nicely on to the next option. So as I just mentioned, we can, the Dataverse Web API is a fully compliant OData version 4 endpoint. So we can not only sort of execute, bring in our data, using sort of OData type syntax as part of that, but we can also do some more advanced, interesting things. And one of these is actually execute any sort of predefined queries that we may have built out using, for example, let's say fetch XML. So fetch XML is, if you've had any sort of familiar, any dealings with Dynamics CRM or 365 in the past, you may know what you may know, and you may have maybe conflicted opinions regarding fetch XML, but effectively it's one mechanism through which we can query data from within Dataverse. It's effectively just best way of describing it is that it's basically like it's the XML version of SQL. Okay, and effectively anything that we build in terms of, let's say, views within this sort of the Dataverse application, behind the scenes it will be executing fetch XML queries. And if we're using things, let's say, like reports and stuff like that, then again, fetch XML will be the primary query language that we've got. So if we are in a situation where, let's say, maybe we're migrating across from, let's say, Dynamics CRM on-premise to 365 online, or to the Dataverse from CRM on-premise, then potentially we've got a route here to be able to maybe get some mileage out of any existing fetch XML queries that we built out. And we've got, and through that, some additional options become available to us. So we can do things like such as outer joins. We can do things such as grouping and aggregates, and we can do those at the API level as opposed to having to worry about doing it from within Power BI. Now, this is an option I wouldn't recommend you to do this if you're working with Dataverse for the first time. It's definitely more of an advanced scenario. You're going to have to get your hands probably a bit dirty with Power Query and M-code to be able to sort of do this. And really, if you've not got that familiarity already with working with fetch XML, then it would probably be a non-starter anyway. But this is potentially one route, again, for you to consume data from the Dataverse. And again, the emphasis here is that if you are migrating away from the applications that I spoke about, then this could be a viable option for you to consider. Got another question here from Matthias. Any experience on how eager companies are to pump all their data into a cloud? I think it really does depend on the industry type. There will be certain specific companies who may still be quite nervous, because obviously their anticipation is that they want to be able to know exactly where their sort of data is stored and stuff like that. I think there is generally been a bit of a mindset change around all of this. I think there's now a recognition that really, if organizations want to get the most out of their data in terms of consuming the latest cloud services, in terms of doing things like working with AI or machine learning and things like that, then really they're going to have to start to effectively pump their data out into the cloud in order to get those benefits. So I think, yeah, there's still some challenges from what I see, but certainly I think it's an improving picture over time. And then a question here from Rishi. So connecting to Dataverse supports query folding, incremental refresh, and dynamic M parameters. So that will be a yes on all three, I believe. Dynamic M parameters, I'm pretty sure, yeah, that's supported with direct query. So yeah, so provided that we are using steps which are supported from a query folding standpoint, we can basically have full direct query capabilities. And effectively, what it will then do is it will then translate that into the appropriate SQL statements when it's executing it against the TDS endpoint in Dataverse. So if we go back now to this option here, fetch XML queries, one thing that we can turn to maybe help us along when we're sort of going down this route is to use a nice little community tool known as the Power Query M Builder. So this has been built out by Mohammed Rashid and another Microsoft MVP, Ulrich Carlson. Ulrich's the guy to go to if you need to do anything to do with charts within sort of model-driven Power Apps and things like that. And what this will let you do is that you can effectively generate the appropriate M code queries to get your data, based off a fetch XML query you define, or to go back to what we spoke about before we started earlier, the ability to actually query based off table views, generate the appropriate M code based off any existing table views that you built out in the application. And as part of that, the snippet will have support for being able to handle paging. You can do things such as bring out your label values for choice columns. You can also generate OData query parameters instead, if you're more comfortable working with that. I could talk all day about this tool. It really is a really amazing tool. So if you wanted to explore this a bit further, then you can download something called the XRM Toolbox. And then from within there's a specific plugin that you then install, which will be this one. And then you can start to hopefully experiment a bit further with these features. So another question from Swanid. What data size does Dataverse give poor performance, or is it auto-scaled as a managed service? It is the latter there. So this effectively Microsoft is managing all of this behind the scenes for us as a sort of managed service. So it will scale up the databases based on what it's doing. Behind the scenes, as I mentioned earlier, it's doing things such as running, creating indexes. It's running frequent sort of system jobs to be able to maintain statistics and obviously, generate any improved query plans where possible. So effectively, from a scalability standpoint, it should scale very nicely. And certainly, from my own experience, I would definitely trust Dataverse, a lot more, and Dataverse and Microsoft to handle that for me, as opposed to, let's say, having a SQL Server database maybe being maintained by one individual within my organization. It's better to rely on hopefully the bigger cloud providers, and obviously the economies of scale that they bring into the equation to be able to handle the difficult stuff for us, and that would be certainly one of the things that they would do for us. Okay, so let's jump in and do a very brief demo then of what we just saw. We can see how we can work with the TDS endpoint within Dataverse. So I jump back into Power BI Desktop first of all, click on Dataverse at the top. It's going to ask me for my environment URL. So in this case, I'm going to go back to my browser. I'm going to want to grab the URL of the organization, but I just need to make sure that I'm not including the HTTPS bit at the start. Because effectively, we're going to be going in via the TDS endpoint, and it needs to be a URL like this. Effectively, it's not if we have HTTPS in front of it, then it's going in via the wrong port, which from a SQL SQL Server has different ports compared to HTTPS or SSL. So that looks okay. So we're going to hit OK on that now. It's already detected who I'm logged in as and be able to do that straight away. We can see it brings back all of my different tables. So once again, I can maybe just grab my account, let's do contacts again, and also maybe the tasks table. Notice here that we get just tables only as part of this, so nothing else as part of the equation. And they're going to hit on transform data just to maybe give it a quick look in the Power Query editor. So we can see on here that brings the data back. The columns are in a sort of random order. So there will again be maybe some work that we need to do just to get that sorted out and just remove the information pieces that we're not interested in. If we scroll across to the end, we can see that every single relationship that's defined is added on as an expandable sort of table or column that we can just sort of quickly interrogate down a bit further. So we don't necessarily need to figure out all of the different sort of relationships and spend all that hard time looking at that. We can at any point confirm that maybe our query is working, is obviously applying query folding in the correct way. So we can see, because we've got the native query over here, it's been able to do that for us. If we were to do something crazy, like maybe do I think if we do a custom column as an example, so I'll just do, doesn't really matter what the value is too much. Okay, that has worked. Let me try maybe something else like a pivot instead. Let me just delete both of those. So let's do a maybe transpose. Yeah, so we see we get the warning straight away to inform us that it's no longer in direct query mode. So effectively, we would have to then switch to import mode to sort of return that. So provided that we're doing, minimal or supported query folding modifications to our data, we can make use of direct query as part of that. Just to show you the differences very quickly, if we were to maybe use the old connector, we can have a quick look at how that sort of looks from an option standpoint. We'll click on Power Platform, select the legacy connector like so. It's going to ask me for the server URL. So in this case, I want to make sure that I've included the HTTPS because it's going in via the web API as opposed to the TDS endpoint. And then we can see we get two options on here where we can reorder our columns, and we can also add display columns for our lookups. So I'll just set both of those options to true, just so we can see what the output of that is. Press OK. Might ask me to log in again. Okay, maybe not. Okay, and we can see that it brings in the same list of sort of tables. So we can see there's our account, a contact table, etc. So maybe just want to grab the account table as an example. If we were to expand out the system folder, we can see that we should have some additional options down here. So effectively, any web API function that's been defined within the organization is queryable as well, or usable at this level. So for example, we could do a who am I request, potentially just to get details about the current user who's logged in. So let's just add both of that in and just see how that looks. So we can see in this case that obviously we still get a lot of columns coming in, but it's been nicely reordered for us. So we can maybe find what we need a little bit faster. We can see that we've got display columns coming in now for our option sets and things like that by default. But what we don't get at the back end is any indication on what the relationships are in this particular table. So effectively, we would have to figure that out ourselves and bring in the additional sort of table objects that we're interested in to be able to sort of work with and figure that out. And then functions will typically return in sort of something like this. So the who am I function is basically just returns information about who the user is, the business unit they exist in, and the organization as well. So one potential benefit that we could use instead. But as I mentioned, if you wanting to not use this legacy connector for the reasons I've stated, then another option you can look at as well is that you've got the OData feed option as well. So again, this works in much the same manner. As long as we put in the URL, actually, no, we need to get a slightly different URL, I should say. We will get this from the classic interface within our Dataverse environment. So what I would do is I would go to customize the system. I go to developer resources, and I've grabbed this endpoint over here that's got API data at the end of it. So let's pop that in. It'll ask me to log in yet again. So let's just do that. Let me just type in the full password. and do the whole multi-factor electric boogaloo. There we go. So again, we get similar experience. We get all of the tables exposed out, and again, all of our functions as well. So, you know, effectively, it's horses for courses maybe, but you know, if you wanted to avoid using the legacy connector because of the risks around it, then maybe the OData route would give you maybe a bit more versatility, and obviously give you some support for the features that the current Dataverse connector is still missing. But it's going to be, over time, that should improve, and we should start to see some investments there to hopefully fill in any gaps around it. Gary's got a great question in the chat. Can we connect to custom tables and columns created in Dataverse? Yes, we absolutely can. So when we hook up and we see our list of tables, it will show out any and all custom tables that we've got access to based on our user account. And then likewise for the tables that we bring in, we would see added in any custom columns with their appropriate prefix as well. So we've got full support for that as part of this. Okay, so that wraps it up for that demo then. So just going to go back to the slides for a little bit, just to touch upon some other options, and then a final demo, hopefully to see us to the home stretch. So another option to consider, and this will really be for where you've got some commitment and some requirement around integrating into Azure, or maybe working, you know, with a lot of data from Dataverse. But we've got the ability of being able to export out all data from within our Dataverse environment into an Azure data lake. And this can effectively be done on a continuous basis. So as our data is sort of changed and worked with within our Dataverse environment, we can effectively just set up an automatic export of that. We don't have to write any code as part of that, or maintain anything particularly complex. The platform will just handle that for us behind the scenes. And ultimately, we can get this exported out, and we can then consume that data in whatever manner we wish from within Azure. So a pretty nice option to consider. It does require you to be working with Azure and have that commitment from an infrastructure and from a billing standpoint. You may need to do some configuration within your environment as well. So, for example, only tables that have been enabled for change tracking will be supported for Data Lake. There will be some geographical or tenant restrictions, so you need to just check where your your Azure subscription or your resources are, and compare that to your CRM, to your Dynamics, your Dataverse region first next. And what I would say as well is that if you wanted to then maybe consume this from Power BI, it's not going to be as straightforward as the other options that we spoke about. But it's worth mentioning it is a viable option to consider. It really just depends what your preference is, and really what you hope to, what you ultimately wanted to do with this data as part of all this. To set this up, what you would do first of all is create a storage account within Azure. You need to make sure that this is aligned to your specific region. So in this case, based on the environment URL, CRM11, we need to make sure that our storage account, our data lake store, is in UK West data center. And then there's a specific option that we need to enable as well for hierarchical namespaces down here. And then with those enabled, it will then go off and create a data lake account for us. For within the Power Platform from the Maker portal, what we can then do is then set up the link to our data lake. We just basically hook it up to a storage account that's in the same region. And then we just select the tables that we want to be able to sync out as part of the profile. From there, when we then inspect the our storage account, we'll see that we've then got appropriate folders set up for each of our table types, and then CSV data files that then show all the data that we are exporting out. And effectively, we get a CSV file per year effectively for that. What we just need to make sure as part of this is that when we're setting it up, that we've given ourselves the appropriate permissions to be able to access into that storage blob. So storage blob data reader role should be sufficient in most cases. You could, of course, give yourself more excessive privileges, but yeah, it's probably at your own risk, I'd say, on that one. From there, we can then pull in this content from in Power BI by connecting up to the storage account, and what we'd effectively see is something a little bit like this. We then have to go in and maybe interrogate these specific files and then sort of extract out the data that we want. It's a bit more complex. not something that you're going to. I'd recommend you do on day one working with Dataverse. So Gary Palmer, another question. So do the relationships also get exported? No, they wouldn't. So you'd have to, if you are interested in viewing how the different tables relate to themselves in Data Lake, then you need to go in and export those out as well when you're setting up the profile. Okay, and we've got another question on here. So Rishi is asking, what is the best way to synchronize in real time between Dataverse and Azure? E.g., if you want your ETL in Azure but have the data available straight away in Dataverse. So if you wanted to maybe synchronize between maybe other systems and Dataverse, then I would maybe suggest you use tools maybe like Azure Data Factory to maybe achieve that, and then run pipelines on the frequencies that you need to be able to get the data synchronized. You could also maybe look at logic app triggers to be able to get to sort of orchestrate that perhaps. You could also maybe write a bespoke application, maybe using service bus queues or something like that. There's definitely a few different options on there, but I'd probably gravitate towards Azure Data Factory in the first instance. Okay, so let's move on now and look at how we can maybe consume some of our content from within the Dataverse. And what I mean by that specifically is from within a model-driven Power App. So an obvious question may surface at this point. Okay, well, why do we do that at all in the first place? Well, there's a few different benefits. So the great thing about Power BI is that we're not always consuming just Dataverse data from within there. It could be that we've got, and we will have, lots of different other line of business systems that we wanted to pull data in from. So if we wanted to provide a mechanism to surface this non-Dataverse data within our model-driven Power Apps, then it's a great option to consider. These days it's very easy to set up and maintain as a solution, and it will also open the doors to some more advanced scenarios that a model-driven app or charts dashboards will just not be able to accommodate whatsoever. So for example, if you've got queries that need to maybe do some pivoting, if we've got geographic data that needs displaying on a map, or if we maybe wanted to work with more complex visualization types or things like that, then all of these and more will be great fits for Power BI, not something that any of the out-of-the-box charts or dashboards within our model-driven apps can necessarily support. So to get started, what we can do is we can actually embed an entire Power BI dashboard from within into our particular environment. We can add these in not only as personal dashboards that only I as a user can consume, but also as ones that all users can consume as a system dashboard instead. We can also use environment variables in support of this. So maybe if we wanted to adopt a bit more of an ALM approach around all of this application lifecycle management, and be able to support moving our content between environments, that gives us the ability to do that. Excuse me, the thing to mention with this is that there's a specific option that we need to enable on the tenant level before we can start working with this, and we'll show you how to get to this in a few moments, but effectively it's in the settings page from within the environment. We just need to make sure this option here is enabled. When that's done, we can see that all of these options will then become available, and we can start to work with this content within our model-driven apps. Another option as well is that we can actually embed an entire report onto a model-driven app form. So again, we need to make sure that we've got this embedding option enabled on the environment before this will become available to us. But one of the challenges with this route is that it does require us to actually go in and manually modify the underlying form XML to be able to sort of do this. So we're not going to be able to straightforwardly, as a system customizer, go in and add these snippets on ourselves in a straightforward manner. So once again, the community steps up, and we've got this really great tool from Ivan Fico, which can basically help us along doing this. And we can maybe dip in and maybe show you this if we get a bit of time in a few minutes. But effectively, this will take out all the hard work to do with this and allow you to embed in your content very straightforwardly. And again, this is all through this really great tool that I mentioned earlier, the XRM toolbox. So make sure that that's one of the things that you sort of do straight after this. Download that tool and have that in your sort of on standby for when you're doing anything involving Dataverse. It really will help you out quite a bit. Okay, so let's go in and have a look at what we just discussed then, see how it all works and is set up then. So as I mentioned, we need to make sure that we've got a specific setting enabled within our environment. So I'm in the Power Platform Admin Center, admin.powerplatform.microsoft.com. I've gone into my specific environment, and then from there we can then go into settings at the top. Open product and then features. And we can see there's the option there for embedded content, Power BI visualization embedding. So at the moment this is enabled in this particular environment. And then once that's enabled, we can see that some specific options will become available to us when we're working from within the Maker portal. So as an example, if I just go into my solution that I've set up, Power BI demos, we can see that if we were to go in and let's say create a new dashboard, as well as the being able to create the a Power App dashboard, we've also got the option down here for Power BI embedded. So I'm not going to save and create this, but what we can do is we can link this to either a Power BI report or a dashboard. And effectively what it will go off and do is it will query all of the different workspaces that we've got access to. And then from there, we can select the specific report or the specific dashboard that we're most interested in. And once that's created, this will then become available from within our sort of environment. So as an example, in true Blue Peter fashion, here's one I made earlier. So this is linked to a personal dashboard that's been set up on the Power BI side. So if we just have a quick look at how that looks, it's in this workspace down here. Let me just get rid of this. So it's just a very simple dashboard that's pulling in some data from Dataverse, and also an image which isn't loading, but never mind. So actually it links up to that dashboard over there. What I can then do from within my model-driven app, if I go in and edit it, it then becomes a dashboard that I can then just select in the list down there. Then if I go into my dashboards area, within my model-driven app, I can see it then brings in the entire dashboard from the workspace that I've selected. I can work with this from within the model-driven app, or if I'm interested in inspecting a bit further, I can just open it up completely in Power BI Online for further inspection. It's a pretty good option, that. If I wanted to maybe, for my own personal purposes, consume a dashboard that I've created, you can see here I've got an option for Power BI dashboard that I can select. And again, this will work in much the same way. I just select the particular sort of dashboard that I want. So I'll just select the same one again as an example, hit on save. It's going to ask me to leave this page, and I can see my dashboards up here. I've effectively got the same dashboard again, but I can bring in as many personal dashboards that maybe I've set up into my sort of model-driven app to work with. Okay, as I mentioned, we've also got the ability of being able to embed Power BI content from within our forms, as an example. So I'm just going to open up this form on here, and I'll just show you first of all how this experience will potentially look. So in this case, what we're doing is we've embedded in an entire report page into a tab or a section from within our Power BI, from within our model-driven app. And we've used the tool that I mentioned a few moments ago, this XRM Toolbox tool, to be able to support us with that. So let me just get this tool open. I can show you how it all looks and how straightforward it is to set up. Okay, I'm just going to drag this onto the screen when it loads. Okay. So this is the XRM Toolbox over here. We've got lots of handy little apps on here which can do a variety of different things, so it is worth checking out. So if I select the Power BI embedder that's already set up, it's going to ask me to connect to an organization, so I'll just select the one that we're currently hooked up to. So effectively, I'll select, let's say, the account form, select the Power BI demo section down there. And effectively, what it's been able to detect already is that I've got an existing report set up over here. I've been able to sort of change some details about how it sort of looks. So, for example, I could maybe just, you know, a demo report for session. I can maybe change some details here about how it's all formatted. And effectively, all I've had to do is just bring in some details from the Power BI service in order to basically, for it to know which report and which workspace to look at. I can get all this detail by just going into Power BI, navigating into the report that I'm interested in, and then just grabbing the URL at the top up here. So if we were to just put this into Notepad, so effectively we can see that the group ID is this on here, and then the report is then this one on here. All I need to do is just copy and paste those into there. It will then build out the rest for us. If I then publish this report out, it's going to go into the Dataverse environment and just update it out. So we should see that this section name and row span updates accordingly. Whilst we're just waiting, another question from Rishi. So if this Power BI report is direct query against the same Dataverse database as the model-driven app it is embedded into, then essentially it reflects anything else that is done in the app in real time. Yeah, effectively right, because yeah, it's using direct query. So this is a nice way of being able to get that, you know, real-time sort of feedback on our data as we're working with it in the Dataverse. Okay, so I'm just going to hit Control F5, and we can hopefully see that maybe there's been a slight change on here to the name of the section, and maybe, yep, so demo report for session, and it should be occupying slightly more row spaces as well down there. So effectively, we just, you know, tinker about with this until we're happy with the layout and stuff like that, and then it gives us a really nice and easy way to be able to get our Power BI content into our forms, you know. And you know, I'm all for the easy solutions. You know, I don't want to be sat around fiddling about with XML all day. So this is a really great tool from Ivan. So again, he's another fellow MVP. So really great tool here, Ivan. Thank you very much. Okie dokie. So just want to wrap up now with just some closing thoughts, and then we may have some time just for maybe some questions perhaps. So it's worth, so you know, we've touched upon quite a few different ways in which we can maybe work with our Dataverse data today within Power BI. Can we say that maybe any specific one is maybe the best way? Well, I think arguably the fact that we've now got the ability to do direct query into our Dataverse environment, you know, and therefore set up those real-time reports, you know, that's a major benefit now. So certainly, you know, using the new Dataverse connector, I would certainly recommend that to be your go-to destination at least. You know, if you're unsure where to begin, then certainly it's going to hopefully hold you in good stead. And, you know, it's going to give you that, and also, you know, it'll give you the satisfaction as well that it's also going to be supported as well in the months and years ahead. What I would say is that Legacy Connector, although it's there, it's still got some options. Obviously, the clue's in the name, it's legacy. Don't be relying on it for maybe new reports or projects unless there's no other option available to you. Because again, you'll have to go through potentially, you know, a refactor in the future to move across the new connector. And then for the more advanced requirements, then you've got Data Lake Route as an example. We also touched upon being able to execute fetch XML queries as well. So again, whether you're maybe just dipping your toe or maybe you want to go a bit deeper, there's definitely quite a few options that we've got here at our disposal. In closing then, you know, I'd argue that maybe today it's easier than ever before to start to work with Power BI alongside Dataverse. And really what you should be trying to think about is, as much as possible, making Power BI your sort of first preference reporting tool to use alongside Dataverse. It's going to give you, you know, the ability to be able to build those really nice looking reports that bring in data from multiple different sources and hopefully do some pretty impressive things, you know, in the process. You know, when as with any data source, it's obviously important that you've got that good awareness of how Dataverse sort of operates. So I'd recommend that, you know, if you are a little bit unsure after today, or you still, or then maybe go in and maybe look at how the Dataverse is sort of built out, look at the various different underlying data types it supports, familiarize yourself with how relationships works, one to many, many to many, things like that, and that will hopefully help you out quite a bit. And ultimately and crucially, make sure that you've reviewed and considered any licensing concerns before you start rolling your content out. You don't want to be in a situation where you're then having to have the conversation with people in the business that, oh, we're going to need to buy, hundreds of licenses because, we didn't realize that with free that we couldn't share our reports out. So avoid those awkward conversations and consider the impact of licensing. And I touched upon this earlier, just before we finish off. Dataverse has got this history. It's inherited. It's got this relation to how Dynamics CRM and Dynamics 365 work. So in most cases, a solution that would also work for those systems will also be one that works for Dataverse as well. So just keep that in mind, maybe when you're doing your research or you're looking into the product and things like that. Okay, so a couple of things just to keep in, maybe takeaways and things to look at. I'll put these in the chat now. So you've got the ability of being able to set up a developer plan for that gives you access to a Dataverse environment. I definitely would recommend that you check those out. You've also got lots of different learning paths available from Microsoft that can really hopefully get you prepared to start working with Dataverse and things like that. So again, I'll just put that in the chat. And then I will have to probably hand back to Chris now because we are on time, unfortunately. And I think there'll be another speaker ready to go. There
certainly is, Joe. But firstly, obviously, thank you for the session and answering all the questions as you went along. It was great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording now. But a big thank you for coming on the session and presenting such an interesting topic.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.